On Tisha B'Av, it's a Jewish custom that we don't say shalom. We don't use the word shalom to one another. We try not to greet people. If someone tries to greet you, so you nod your head, you're trying to show that, we don't say hello, shalom, we don't say on Tisha B'Av. And the reason that is given is that we are not complete. We're lacking, we don't have that. The vessel's broken, basically. And we think about the terrible tragedy of our two temples that were destroyed and what they symbolize and what they are for our people. We try to identify with that broken vessel, which will, God willing, be rebuilt. But today, our job is on this day to identify with the sorrow and the mourning of our temple. There are those that don't fast on this day. Unfortunately, their hearts are totally, I'm not talking about people that are ill, that can't, that have medical issues, of course, but those that choose not to fast, for them, it's a historical event, whatever. And that lack of sensitivity is just a lack of connection to our tradition, to our, much more than just a tradition, of course, but to our source of life. The temples are our life source. That is our history. That is our future. And when someone disengages from our history, from our tradition, from who we are, clear signs of disengagement are indifference, not interested, just want to totally worried about filling up their bellies, another day to fill their belly up, but not to really focus and to contemplate and to sit and cry and to think about where we are today, where were we when tragedy has befallen us, and where we're going, how we're heading towards our future. And things that are not, again, for our personal benefit, things that are for the benefit of the nation, to build the nation of Israel, which will bring a blessing and a future for the entire world, which we call Gula, redemption. So this is the day that we combine, it's important to combine national tragedies on this day, because they're all part of that historical link to our temple. It's all part of every destruction that befalls us. It comes from the lack of the rebuilding of the temple. As our sages tell us, the generations that do not experience the rebuilding of the temple in their day, those generations is as if it was destroyed in their lifetime, in their generation. In other words, we have to do what we can to focus on the rebuilding of our temple, and our third temple that will never be destroyed again. These days are very challenging. We just spoke about, was it last week when I spoke on reflections on Gush Katif, because this is the time on this very, very day is where the decree came out of the Ariel Sharon government of Israel, our very own government, and to disengage from Gaza, as we all know. We call it the Gerush, or the expulsion. One of the greatest tragedies that have fallen upon our people. When Jews through their own brothers and sisters out of their homes, out of the land that they were developing and building for 30 some odd years, and in a crazy, whimsical decision by Ariel Sharon, just personal gain to avoid being prosecuted by the Attorney General. This is really, when we look at the tragedies, and getting back to what we discussed before, that have befallen Israel, and we've experienced, obviously in our time, many, many tragedies. They're all part of that rebuilding process. We have to rebuild our connection to the land, our heritage in the land. When Israel came back and reformed the state of Israel, as we build our third temple, it started with a process of a lot of, though we have many Orthodox Jews, those who are connected to their roots, but we know Ben-Gurion's government and the whole Mapaynikim, as we say, in the left, in the beginning, that were draining the swamps. Many were very secular, totally threw away the divine idea. But now, this will have to be rectified and changed as we rebuild our country, which is a very powerful, Israel has become a very powerful country in the world. But without our connection to our Masoret, to our tradition, to our spirituality, we're not able to survive, of course, and not do the function of the people of Israel. And that is really what the events that have taken place. Again, I think we go way back, but since throwing the Jews out of Gush Katif, and even before the Oslo Accords, all this time, from the early 90s until now, we're seeing a big piece of history, although it's going quickly, of how things are changing and the mindset of Israel is changing. All this is leading us towards a renewal, to renew our connection to our people, to our Torah, to the creator of the universe. All this will come to be as a result of these difficult things that we're going through. So we have to see everything we've been through as a part of the process. Of course, things could be avoided if we only would wake up in time and see the handwriting on the wall. But sometimes there's no way of Israel learning as a nation unless it goes through the fire, sowing its oats, as they say. And I'll give an example. If we look in this week's portion that we just read in Dvarim, the Midrash brings down that there are three people, three prophets, that prophesies with the word Echa. Echa means a bewilderment. How could it possibly be? And one of them was Moshe Rabbeinu, who began prophesying this way, as we read about it in our opening portion of Dvarim, in verse number 12, where it says, Echa esal levadi. How can I bear alone tochachem umasachem v'rivchem, your burden, your quarrels? I mean, Moshe Rabbeinu is screaming, how can I do this? How can I bear your burden? That same expression the Midrash brings is with Yeshayahu, Isaiah the prophet. As we read yesterday in Shabbat Chazon, the Shabbat known as the Shabbat of the Vision, where Isaiah says in verse number 21, chapter 1, Echa ita lizona kiryat ne'emana. How could a city of ne'emana, a city that is a reliable city of faith, become like a harlot? In other words, to choose idolatry over choosing God, following the path of Hashem, of Israel, the Torah of Israel. And finally, the third prophet to use that expression of Echa, bewilderment, was the prophet Jeremiah. And Jeremiah says, Echa yashva badad. How could the city of Jerusalem sit in solitude? A city that was once a huge population is now like a widow. I mean, this is, Jeremiah is screaming, crying, what happened to Jerusalem? And the Midrash brings the connection of these three, like three links of a chain, saying that it's likened to a queen that has three friends, and she saw each friend in a certain period of its lifetime. One friend she saw as in its honor, and that was the period of Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert of Israel, that leadership time. Israel was still in its glory, with all the things that went on, and nevertheless Israel was still in its glory. In the time of Isaiah, we know it's 150 years before the destruction of the temple. It's still enough time beforehand, but she saw Israel in its reckless behavior, not behaving properly. As Isaiah describes what was going on in Judah and Jerusalem. And finally, when it talks about Jeremiah, it talks about how the queen, when she saw Jeremiah, the expression by Jeremiah of how can a city be in the solitude, is looking at a friend in disgrace, a total disgrace. So we see a process from glory to disgrace through a situation of reckless behavior that eventually brings about the disgrace. The message that Midrash was trying to show us, that all three prophets, they're all connected to the rectification process, is in order to rectify, in order to go back to the glory of Israel, we have to contemplate over what brought about our disgrace. What were the actions that led up to the terrible tragedy? And when we contemplate and we focus on this very day of Tisha B'Av, as we are commanded to do so, to think about, to reflect upon what has brought about the terrible, terrible tragedy that brought down our temples, the sins that were behind it, the lack of unity, all the reasons that we find them together. We know it's a puzzle, it's a complete picture. Together with the way Israel's come back to the land now, because now we're in this process, on one hand, of rebuilding our third temple. At the same time, we are going through the pains of this section of history. But to see where we're, the setbacks and things, how we're going to go forward again. You know, one way we look at the terrible tragedy of Gush Katif, what a terrible setback. But of course, at the end, we have to see how could we make good come out of all the happenings, these evil happenings, when we learn from them. And we learn not to go back there again, where we were in that terrible conceptions, false and lie conceptions. And now the answer to rectify is to go back to something else, to rebuild and resettle Gush Katif. When the Jewish presence will return to those places, we're going to be on the right road, as we are now in the northern Samaria, which we're also evacuating. But we're rectifying there. So one of the great simple remedies of our bad behavior is to rebuild. And of course, we have to remember what brought about and what brings about the tragedy is only our giving a cold shoulder to our history, our tradition, our people, indifference, and that's what has to rectify those who don't even think about a day of Tisha B'Av, of fasting. I mean, it's something that is hard to believe. There's an expression that I mentioned before, is that on the fast of Yom Kippur, we always say, who could possibly think of eating on Yom Kippur? You don't need to. And on the 9th of Av, on the day of today, you ask yourselves, how could one possibly eat today? I mean, how could anyone get an appetite to eat on a day with such tragedy, right, took place? So on Yom Kippur, we don't need to eat, because we're just on a spiritual level. We connecting to the upper world and feel that God forgiving us. But on a Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning like this, how do we have an appetite to eat? If you're properly connected, if you're properly in tune to our people, to what we've gone through, how we've suffered so much. You know, on this day, many tragedies are remembered today, and they all come together in that same picture, the lack of our building of our temple. For example, we know when the Crusaders launched their crusades in the year 1096, the first crusade, they came, Urban II, who launched the crusades in the year 1096, Tuf Nun Vav, which are known as the the pogroms of the year 4856 according to the Jewish calendar. They came in these three German areas of Pira and Vromaiza and Maknetza, those three German cities, and they literally slaughtered the Jews. 12,000 Jews were slaughtered. According to the historians, about 12,000 Jews were murdered, and because they didn't want to change their religion, etc. And the little murder, you can't imagine the bloodbath. On Shabbat, when we say the prayer every Shabbat, prayer remembering those who were killed in Kiddush Hashem, that was actually created after this terrible tragedy of Kilot Shum, which we call it Ava Rachaman, Father of Mercy. And in addition, we read today, on Tisha B'Av, we're reading one of the Lamentations written by Rabbi Yehuda Kolonimus, or Rabbi Kolonis Bar Yehuda, It's called Mi Yitain Roshi Mayim Ve'eni Makor Nozli. Okay, who would make my head water? In other words, there's so much tears to think about, to let out after thinking about the tragedy of the kilot of Shum, as we say, those three Jewish congregations. And he writes about that tragedy, but that tragedy, which was on again the scale of that particular time in Europe, and whatever, again, as I said before, in 1096 and the Crusades, it was a particular part of history. But we are taking we take that tragedy and we add it to the list of tragedies that we lament on this very day of Tisha B'Av. You could say, wait a second, what does that have to do with anything? It's out there in exile, it's Jews that were slaughtered, by Christians that try to force convert, etc. What does it have to do now? Why do we have to use that as one of our limitations about the building of our temples? But our rabbis have always viewed all these events, these tragic events of Israel, wherever we are, it's all part of rebuilding our third temple. Because as long as our temple is not built, there's always opportunity for evil forces to come and do such terrible things. But once our temple is going to be rebuilt in Jerusalem, no longer we will suffer any of these tragic events anymore. The world will be reaching a whole nother level, because the world, as our sages teach us, if the world only knew what our temple, what a blessing it would bring for them, they would run tomorrow to try to rebuild it. But at the very moment now, we're dealing with the lies and we're dealing with the false conceptions and all that. And that's only because, at the end, we have to, as Jewish people, we have a lot of, obviously, to blame the world of its hatred, for sure. They're anti-Semitic and doing terrible things. And they will be punished for that, what they do. And we'll leave that up to God. But we have to realize that in order for us to make a change, that these things won't happen anymore, we have to awaken our hearts from indifference, from lack of mourning over our temples, and from false conceptions, and connect to our heritage and our Torah, and to learn from those events, those tragic events. And then we will be able to reach our building of our third temple, our redemption. Isaiah, when he said the word Echaz, we said that was 150 years before the destruction of the temple. But nevertheless, he saw the signs, the handwriting on the wall, and he was trying to warn everyone, wake up now. Now's the time to wake up. Before it's too late, and of course, people didn't wake up, and it eventually led to destruction. But now we could say, as we rebuild, we're getting so close to rebuilding our temple. We have to wake up now. We don't have much time. We're very close. It's the year 6000. It's not far away. We have to wake up and do what we can. And it begins again by our love and our connection to our people that will bring about our Geula Shlema. Let this Tisha B'Av ring in our hearts and be the last Tisha B'Av. Next year, let us rejoice with the building of our Beit HaMikdash.